right. Good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Dr. Amy Owen, Director of Digital Policy for Excel in Ed. And today we'll be featuring leaders from 3 states that are adopting policies to strengthen their workforces, particularly related to digital and technology-enabled careers. As we all know, technology is rapidly changing the way we work, live, learn, and interact with each other. And as a result, the demand for digital careers is increasing at an unprecedented pace. This has created a pressing need with policymakers, educators, and industry leaders to work together to ensure that our workforce is equipped with the necessary skills to meet this demand. In today's webinar, we'll hear from leaders from 3 states who have taken bold steps to address this challenge. They are Eric Leach, Director of the Governor's Office of Workforce Transformation in Ohio, Brian Shea, who's supporting the Cyber Ecosystem Coordination Initiative for South Carolina's Department of Commerce, and Larry Williams, President and CEO of the Technology Association of Georgia. We're also joined by Excel in Ed's Adriana Harrington, Senior Policy Director for Pathways, who will spotlight resources Excel in Ed offers related to strengthening career pathways overall. The panelists will share their insights, experiences, and lessons learned as they work to strengthen their workforces and prepare citizens for the digital age. We will hear about the policies, programs, and initiatives that these panelists have implemented to build a pipeline of talent and foster a culture of innovation. We'll also have an opportunity to ask questions and engage in a dialogue with our speakers. We hope this webinar will provide you with valuable insights and inspiration to drive similar efforts in your own states. Thank you for joining us, and we are looking forward to this engaging and informative discussion. So let's go ahead and dive in with our first question, and we'll take it in turns with our 3 state panelists. Eric, Brian, and Larry, each of your states identified a workforce shortage related to digital careers in different industries. Can you walk us through why you chose that area of the workforce to really focus on strengthening it, and how that work has been going to date? We'll start with you, Eric. Let's hear about Ohio.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you, Amy, for the question. In Ohio, Governor Mike DeWine and Lieutenant Governor John Husted really wanted to make sure that all of Ohio is connected. As everyone knows, with the pandemic, the inequities of broadband access really came to bear once things started to shut down due to the coronavirus pandemic. And so in 2021, when we were going through our last budget cycle, the governor, lieutenant governor invested over $250 million in state dollars on top of all the federal and private investments that were coming online to support broadband expansion. And so with that, they wanted to make sure that we had a workforce to physically build the infrastructure. And so our team was tasked with evaluating whether if we did, yes or no, and if not, how are we going to get there? We quickly realized that we didn't have enough workers for broadband expansion. There weren't enough workers pre-COVID, and it was only becoming a compounding issue because one, you're getting a ton of money dumped into the system across the country, and many telecom employers work across multiple states. And on top of that, the carriers were also beginning to deploy 5G at scale, which takes some of the similar skill sets and occupations as you need for broadband expansion. So you had compounding issue after compounding issue. And so once we realized we didn't have the workforce, we quickly mobilized our team to begin evaluating, what were the issues that we needed to address. And then we began working with industry, education, and government stakeholders to begin addressing that. So that's why we picked telecom, because in order for us to move forward in the 21st century economy, we need to make sure that all of Ohio is connected.
Thank you. And that is so relevant. As you mentioned, we have, billions and billions of dollars in federal funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act coming available. And that's something that every state will want to be able to leverage effectively. Brian, I know South Carolina is in some of the beginning exploratory stages of setting up a strategy. Why are they choosing to focus on cybersecurity?
Yeah, so as with most cybersecurity improvement stories, it starts with a bad experience followed by a bunch of good experiences. In 2012, there was a high-profile data breach at the Department of Revenue in the state, and that was really the catalyst for a lot of successes since then over the past decade to advance policies and capabilities for improving cybersecurity in the state. Most notably, initial steps were taken to improve the protection and response capabilities, both for state agencies as well as for critical infrastructure operators across the state. At the same time, over the past decade, we've seen a lot of focused cyber growth in the neighboring states of Georgia and Florida, leveraging key Department of Defense assets and educational assets. And both of those states, something else they have in common that we see in very strong connected cyber hubs are very top-down, gubernatorial-led efforts. So you've got a state where we've had a big cyber breach. We see cyber growth happening around us. And then at the same time, the third driver is the state's been embarking upon a broader push for science and technology advancements, and key industries are modernizing and requiring modernized workforces to support them. So all of those drivers resulted in a lot of kind of one-off cyber efforts that really warranted some top-down coordination and strategy. Lots of stakeholders in lots of silos who realized that they're 5% of a bigger pie, and they realized that they would all benefit from some collective coordination and strategy from the top down. So to be clear, my comments today, I'll try to keep them focused on the career pathway and workforce development piece. But this initiative is definitely a holistic one where we're considering education and workforce development, innovation, investment, defense partnerships, cyber posture and readiness, and economic growth. Just one piece about of all the things we could invest in, why cybersecurity. And I think you all know, in South Carolina, the hard data is that earnings for cybersecurity professionals are more than 3 times the median wage in the state. And at the same time, unemployment is as much as 5 times lower than average unemployment in the state. So we're talking about investing in the workforce that has outsized earnings potential. I don't want to call it unemployment proof, but it might be the closest thing we have to unemployment proof right now, and very high projected growth over the next 10 years.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing all that about South Carolina. I know we'll want to dig into some of what you've found in terms of statistics and about the size of the need in a little bit here. Larry, tell us about what's going on in Georgia. We've often thought of Atlanta as a big hub for financial technology, but I know you've really been working to expand it just beyond the city center. And can you tell us how that's kind of dovetailed with some of this digital career work?
By all means, thanks. It's great to see you. Really, we do think about technology and innovation and the skill sets that need to drive these industries in a broad sense. Fintech is an area that we've had a lot of dominant area. 70% of all debit, credit, and reward card transactions in North America are processed through Georgia, and that's primarily through Atlanta and Columbus. We're also keeping ahead of the curve, where right now 80% of all global commercial cryptocurrency transactions are now processed through Georgia. So it's an area, as I say, if you're 51%, you're number one. If you're 70 or 80%, you dominate. And it's an area that we really dominate in the transaction processing. And so we've done some great things to make sure that we're keeping up with the skill sets, including working with our higher education, the University System of Georgia, as well as the governor's office, to create a FinTech Academy. And that's in our 4-year institutions. But we also look through our technology college system of Georgia to see how we can prepare those skills as well. The sectors that were strong, cybersecurity, everybody is because of the demand, making sure they're taking advantage of those opportunities, as Brian outlined. It's an area that we've helped with the Department of Defense actually build the layers of the onion of all cybersecurity back going towards mainframes, network, internet security, and created some great globally dominant companies out of that, like ISS, that's now part of IBM, and SecureWorks with Dell, and it continues. So those are extremely important careers. But what we've really found is whether we're helping people develop skills for FinTech, cybersecurity, digital health, digital media and entertainment, there are a lot of base skills that need to go into that are transferable, where you can actually start to branch out into many different careers once you get those. So I think there are a couple of things as we prepare people for things like computer programming, for example. We have an initiative that computer programming will be offered in every high school, public high school in Georgia by 2025, which is just around the corner, something that we've been working on for years. We have a strong relationship with our technical college system of Georgia to really think about workforce development. That is, how do we upskill, reskill, or develop new skills for people to be able to fill these things, because they don't all require 4-year degrees. We have to work with the public sector, but there are also private sector options as well to help get people the skills that they need. So we're really focused more on those aptitudes. What are those aptitudes, regardless of what industry sector they need, so that we can then direct them and fill the gaps in for the industries that need them. One other critical thing is making sure that we have the infrastructure across the state for people to be able to take advantage of these areas. So broadband access, we think of that as, a rural issue, but quite frankly, there are plenty of areas in urban areas that don't have access to high-speed broadband. And that's a fundamental, now it's like, having water or electricity to your house. You've got to have broadband to be able to take care of, take advantage of educational opportunities, other learning opportunities, as well as, it's how we connect with people. And even, if people decide to be entrepreneurs, then we're all doing that in the digital world now.
Absolutely. It's also fascinating to hear how much these different themes blend across states. It's not just that, only Ohio's doing broadband, Georgia's thinking about it. South Carolina and Georgia are both thinking cybersecurity. And Eric, I'm sure you are too. Turning to Adriana, each of these states has surfaced their workforce needs through communicating with industry leaders and their education and training programs. Can you talk to us more in general? How can states establish policies that ensure that these conversations occur regularly and across sectors?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what the three panelists have been bubbling up have huge implications as we think about how a state is more on the broader sense preparing for the workforce of today and the workforce of tomorrow, and making sure that digital careers are an integral part of what's happening, but that states are also looking at that broader set of what needs to be in place for learners and for kind of economic stability of the state. The first policy that I want to point out, and these are available on pathwaysmatter.org, I'll put a link in the chat in a second, is something that Brian teed up beautifully. How are states leveraging data to know what those priority sectors are, what those priority occupations are, and for what we already have working on the ground in states, what's happening to learners who are in those current paths, and do those need to be updated? So we call this a return on investment analysis, where states are kind of really taking a deep look at their data to figure out the labor market right currently, and a lot of states have some type of future projection calculation that they fold in as a proxy to see, like, where are the trends, right? Where should we be going? And then on the flip side of that is looking at learner outcomes. So if a learner is in a program of study that already exists in a high school, what happens to them? Do they earn the industry credential that employers need? Do they go on to the post-secondary and stack into the appropriate kind of level of credential that is viable for them in terms of a family sustaining wage and where they want to be, and also supporting the kind of regional and statewide economy? We know that data is so integral, and most states have a lot of this data at their fingertips, but how is it being leveraged in the decision-making process by the folks right here, right? The folks who are making the decisions, and how is it being leveraged back to learners so they can make those decisions that are best for them, especially in these burgeoning careers, right? How are we messaging to them what Brian just said about you're practically guaranteed a job in this specific sector, so that they know when they're embarking on that course of study. And then the other piece that I know Eric is going to talk about is governance makes a really big impact in the pathway space, because it's not just K-12, it's not just post-secondary. Workforce is also at the table. Business and industry leaders also need to be at the table. So what is the back end structure that a state has to make those bigger decisions, to ensure that the right folks are at the table to feed in the information and ensure that they're able to kind of leverage funding appropriately to drive and incentivize change, to create the vision and priorities for the state as it's working towards it. So we have a tool on governance with 3 kind of examples that we've seen in states on how they're thinking about governance, but kind of that dual power of the data and then who has the authority to kind of leverage it to make decisions can have huge impacts in not only the digital kind of career space, but for a state writ large and thinking about its college and career pathways.
That's perfect. And it really tees up our next question, which is where I'd like to dive a little deeper into how each state has been approaching your work. And Eric, let's start with you. ExcelinEd has gotten to be at that table as you're bringing together business and education and government and experts in all of these different fields. And I know firsthand that you all are extremely focused on data, both about your current progress and about what the needs you see moving forward. Can you tell us a little bit more about your broadband 5G sector partnership in terms of how it's structured and funded, and maybe that governance piece that Adriana was talking about?
Sure thing. So before I get to the partnership itself, I should step back a little bit to talk about process, because process is key to any kind of implementation. And so as I discussed before, we put together a workforce strategy, but to do that, you had to engage stakeholders. So we engaged industry up and down the spectrum, literally contractors, unions, ISPs, carriers, you name it, education providers, et cetera. We really learned like what are the common issues. So we did the secondary research, we had an idea, and then we started engaging different segments of the industry to find common threads. So once we found those common threads, we really honed in on 3 areas for the state to focus in on for broadband expansion, 5G deployment. That is industry career awareness. Kids don't know that telecom is a career path. Post-secondary students don't realize telecom is a career path. Dislocated workers, et cetera, et cetera. And those that are aware of telecom think it's a job, not a career. And so really career awareness is a big piece. Second is scaling education and training programs. Telecom is not like manufacturing that's been working with community colleges for 30, 40 years. So we're literally starting from scratch because telecom has historically done everything in-house. And then 3, the third part of the strategy is leveraging state and federal funding to finance this so that it's easier for institutions to say yes, because the biggest barrier to new programs standing up is capital requirements for equipment and other pieces of program standing up programs, and then also to make it low or no cost for Ohioans to go through these training programs. And so to implement those 3 pieces of the strategy, we needed an implementation mechanism. And for that, we decided to have a statewide Ohio broadband and 5G sector partnership where we brought together industry, education, and government to work together on one specific industry sector. And so we had literally everyone that kind of represents all the different segments of telecom. We have everyone from US Telecom to the Fiber Broadband Association, NTCA, PCCA, which represents the contractors, NATE, which represents tower folks. So basically everyone in industry was at the table, serves on our sector partnership. Then we've got all the relevant government stakeholders. So we've got our team, Broadband Ohio, which is our state broadband office. We've got the Department of Higher Education, Department of Education, Rehabilitation and Corrections, Veteran Services, our Labor Department, all these folks at the table, and then as well as our education stakeholders. So the associations that represent our community colleges, our public 4-year universities, our private 4-year universities, and then our career centers, as well as educational nonprofits such as ExcelinEd and Ohio Excels. The reason why we brought all these stakeholders together is because it is such a critical industry that we need to address. But in order to address it, we need to bring all the right stakeholders together and come up with an agreed upon path. So before we implement anything, we run everything through our sector partnership to get feedback, to make sure we're tracking and to make sure we're not leaving any critical pieces out. And so for us, that's how we've leveraged the management and governance of how do we move forward. And then what we do is we create quarterly implementation sprints to do things in bite-sized chunks where we have clear deliverables, clear metrics, and we expect our sector partnership to hold us accountable to those deliverables. And so when we meet quarterly, we report out our previous sprint, where we're at, completions, outcomes, anything that we found challenging, propose new sprints, and move forward in an iterative process. And then data, like Adriana was saying, is such a critical piece to our work. So we've got working groups that are focused on developing new programs, marketing and awareness, entry-level employment, apprenticeship, internships, and a big one is data collection, evaluation, analysis. So everything that we're doing is data informed. We're figuring out where all the programs are located, how many graduates, how many completions do we have, and how does that compare to the demand that we're seeing through the labor market information. So then we can identify where are the key programs that are most critical to triage, because there's a lot to do. And so we need to find a way to prioritize what we're doing first and then go from there. And then we have a whole data collection and tracking system on the back end that we're working to develop. So not only are we tracking enrollments and completions, but we're working to figure out with our Department of Job and Family Services, which is our labor department, how do we track these individuals afterwards to see, are they employed in telecom, and what do wage growth looks like, so that we can make sure that people we're putting through are seeing the economic benefits of participating. So that was a long-winded way of explaining it, but I think that summarizes it.
No, it's extremely helpful. And I'm sure it's also potentially sounding a little overwhelming to folks who have not dipped a toe in this work yet. I know how hard your team has been working over the past 2 years or so on this. For a perspective of a state that's in those initial data gathering and strategizing phases, Brian, can you tell us more about how South Carolina is approaching this work so that in 2 years, y'all are in the place that Ohio is in now, where you're able to actually be taking action on the data? What are you doing to set the state up for success on the front end?
Yeah, great question. I'll start by talking about the data and how we got started. And the end of the story is where kind of Eric already began, which is the formation of some working groups with every type of partner you can imagine at the table. So, we began about maybe a little over 2 years ago. The first thing we did was conducted a comprehensive assessment of the state's cyber ecosystem. All those aspects I mentioned earlier, from innovation to investment to defense partnerships. We interviewed over 80 key stakeholders. We assessed hundreds of responses to an online survey. And then we just conducted tons of desk research to inform upon 3 broad categories of our assessment. The first category was quantitative. So we looked at industry composition, workforce composition, both supply and demand. As I mentioned already, we looked at salaries and unemployment, and we looked at the economic impact of the cybersecurity industry within the state. The second bucket was qualitative. We surveyed employers on their hiring priorities. When they hire a cyber professional, what are the skills and certifications they're most looking for? We assessed the educational and workforce development landscape. What are all of the degree and certificate producing programs that exist right now? And we looked at all the enabling assets. So your incubators, your accelerators, your nonprofits. And in the third bucket that was enabled by the first two was really, we performed a comparative assessment of looking at South Carolina's cyber ecosystem compared against 5 other states in the region. That enabled us to identify relative strengths and weaknesses from our perspective of attraction for workers, executives, and investors. Why should someone choose to bring their talents and their resources to South Carolina? The importance of all of that data, I think, number one, it makes the challenge real and accessible and actionable. We tend to talk about some of these workforce challenges in national aggregate numbers. I think there's a bit of human nature that when you say we need to develop 5,000 workers, that sounds actionable. If we say we need to develop 100,000 workers, I start thinking, well, okay, we'll get to that later. That's a little bit daunting. So I think there's a lot of value in, we know there's a giant national challenge here, but let's make it actionable at a state level that we feel it can actually have a chance of breaking this problem down. The second piece of the data is really just helping to prioritize near-term actions. As one example, we looked at 10 different aspects of our ecosystem framework and found that one of South Carolina's particular challenges was entrepreneur access to capital. We just weren't performing as well in that category as some of our regional neighbors. And so even though we don't necessarily think about capital access as being part of the pathway story, these things are all interconnected. In order for us to put people through these career pathways, there has to be employment at the end of that story. And if we have would-be entrepreneurs who can't bring the next innovative company to the landscape, where are these workers going to be going? So that just tells us that the investment piece needs to be prioritized as more of a near-term action. So where did that all get us today? And this kind of dovetails with what Eric just described. Based on those early findings, we set up a series of 6 working groups, one for each piece of the ecosystem. So one of those working groups is focused on education and workforce development. And just as Eric said, part of the magic of these working groups is that the diversity of those organizations is spread across all 6. So all of our educational partners are not just in the educational working group. We have educational partners in the investment working group, in the innovation working group, in the defense partnerships working group, because their equities and resources need to be considered in each of those conversations. So those working groups are looking at 4 things right now. Number one, we're establishing the mission space for each of those groups, while also establishing the natural connectivity between them. We're establishing metrics for growth and improvement. I think too often we can all fall victim to judging ourselves based on activity and not on outcomes. We need to establish clear metrics for what success looks like. The third one is developing a comprehensive and ambitious strategic plan for long-term growth. What is our vision for the next 10 years and how do we intend to get there? But while we're developing that long-term piece, the fourth piece is what are the near-term wins we can go after right now? So for example, the K through 12 education piece, there are some things we know we can do right now. We don't need to wait a year for a larger strategic plan to be in place before we can address some of those critical needs up front.
What are some of those, if you can share some of those short-term wins for K-12? What's jumping out?
Sure. So the state already has, as I would like to think many do, we already do have standard K through 12 standards for computer science and computer literacy in K through 12, but it's a very resource constrained environment. Not everybody has the time and the resources to check all of the boxes. So we do have some districts that haven't been able to pay enough love to that section right there. Part of the unsurprising gap there is the educator gap. We can't educate K through 12 if we don't have the educators themselves. So we're looking for innovative ways to bring more educators to the table, to help certify more educators. And I want to be very clear, there are 2 types of educators we're talking about here with cyber. The one we tend to think of as maybe your grades 9 through 12, where the instructor is primarily a cybersecurity instructor. But you can make a lot of inroads by the K through 8, the 3rd grade math teacher. We just need to make them a bit more conversant on some cyber basics and help them incorporate cyber education into their existing curriculum. So we're not necessarily talking about cyber experts. It's making existing educators more comfortable and more capable with cybersecurity. So I think it's the kind of lowest hanging fruit here is to address maybe that K through 5 level and help them bring those cyber concepts to the table.
Gotcha. And then that can be built on as students progress throughout their pathways. And Larry, I know that education has been very important in Georgia, and the Technology Association of Georgia has had a big role in building out some of the infrastructure for education and training programs in recent years. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that's looked like and what it's looked like as Georgia has tried to take this existing industry of fintech and other kind of career fields and adapt it to a digital environment? What has your workforce needed and how have you all been supporting that?
Sure, and I think that's one perspective, or the main perspective, that we can come at this from the Technology Association of Georgia and our 501c3, our TAG Education Collaborative, which focuses in on this, is bringing that private sector perspective. We started working with the governor's office in 2014 with our High Demand Careers Initiative, and that's when a lot of the data was just starting to be collected and be implemented in a contemporary way. And those types of things have helped us, guide us into areas, whether it be, our position in the film industry, and both as regular film as well as the digital media and entertainments, and as that has evolved into esports, and helped us develop the skilled workforce to be able to fuel an industry and really become dominant in those areas as well. Because, 20 years ago in economic development, people used to move to where the jobs are. Today and age, companies with jobs are moving to where the people are. So if you have the trained, skilled workforce, then industry will come. So that has, so we've got the film industry, FinTech, is again an area that we have a deep, deep history in. So if you go back to our history, it goes back to check processing. I don't know if many people on this call remember what a check is, or if they've ever balanced a checkbook, but that's where we started, and that's where we started developing our roots so that we could have this establishment in FinTech. Now, keeping up with the workforce, there was a couple of things that did lead to the FinTech Academy, where we could be focused on what are the next generation of skills that are needed. And that goes into everything from, computer programming, engineering, but also things like, data science and analytics, and to the data governance that's needed to be able to do this. And then how do you even take this, information now as we moved into artificial intelligence, machine learning, and actually taking all of this data that's coming at them and actually putting it into something that can be actioned on, and even, thinking a lot about predictive analytics that a lot of our companies are using. These are the areas that are extremely, extremely important. Cybersecurity is another area that was identified out of that high demand careers initiative. So I think one of the things was a big focus on practical learning with a great investment in apprenticeships, an area that is greatly, has been, de-emphasized in the United States over many, many decades. And it's an area that we see coming back. So from a private sector point of view, it's really how do we start to get those, not only the theory and the trainings and the certifications, but how do we actually get them into industry so they can see what it is that we do and how they can apply it here and get that hands-on experience. I mean, all of the points that are being made here, and Amy, you made a statement in the last round of questions about we're all dealing with many of the same things. A lot of these issues are global issues. These are global challenges that we're trying to fill a workforce. If you're talking about, top level PhD guru cybersecurity, these people can write their own ticket because they're in demand all over the world. But then, we talk about, jobs, but I do like to talk about careers. But whether it's people that are putting in the infrastructure, running fiber optic cable, all the way up to people that are doing programming and above, these are great careers that people can build their lives with. So I think that's extremely important. But it's our private sector companies that are providing the input to all of these processes so that we know what we can have. Because one thing, one of the outcomes out of all of these things is we got to make sure that the people that are coming through these programs have a job at the other end, have a career that they can go into. And that doesn't always happen. A lot of times it's because the pace of industry is changing. So you've got to be able to keep up with the times, keep up with the paces, what the trends are. I think the best example is in technology. During the pandemic, there was a hiring frenzy. Hundreds of thousands of people were hired. And now we're starting to see some of those companies starting to, pare back, right size, whatever term you want to use for that. But, I think what's interesting about that, net, there's still more people that were hired, even with any of the layoffs that were going on before. And a lot of the companies, especially small and medium-sized companies who were sort of priced out of the marketplace, are now able to fill that gap and start to pull some of those people in and at a more reasonable rate. So again, I think that private sector perspective is highly, highly beneficial to all of these processes.
Absolutely. And Adriana, that actually leads to a question that I have about pathways policies overall. How can states keep up as industry demands and expectations change so quickly? How can we make sure that the things that we're incentivizing at the state level in terms of high demand, high wage credentials for K-12 and post-secondary are still relevant and germane, and that they're taught to standards that are going to be what industry needs?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's kind of easy in some ways to answer, but also I know that it is very, very hard to do this on the ground. So I think there's a huge piece around employer engagement and how are we supporting employers to really signal what they need in real time, right? Often you'll talk to an employer and they'll say, well, just get me the person with these basic things, and then I can take it from there. And we know that that is not a sustainable structure or system. And how can we get employers to really signal what are they valuing in terms of the industry recognized credentials? What are they valuing in terms of the competencies that they're looking for, and how can they share those back with K-12, which I think is why it's so important, as all three panelists have noted, to have the right folks at the table and having these conversations. The next piece is, are states collecting the data, right? When we did research on Credentials Matter a few years ago, 30 states were collecting data on K-12 industry recognized credential attainment. We know that that has gone up since we did the research, but being able to say, this is what is being earned in K-12. And I think now we're seeing more and more a need for post-secondary to collect information on those non-degree credentials and what's being earned. That is a black hole from a state level for many states. And so once you're leveraging the data to see what's being earned and that alignment, is the list right? Is what's being promoted in terms of the programs of study, in terms of the industry recognized credentials? We know states have huge sway, especially in the industry recognized credential space, in what's earned and offered in K-12 districts and the quality of what's being earned. So how are we looking at kind of what's on that list, and is it right? And I know a lot of states have a review process where they look at that annually or biannually, and thinking about how can K-12 and post-secondary be more folded in together in that review process to make sure there's that seamless transition for learners. And then the last piece is, how are states leveraging funding to make those other pieces happen, right? We know that districts and schools and post-secondary institutions have a lot on their plates. There's a lot of different issues, challenges, strengths, right, that they're celebrating and working towards with learners. But how are we thinking about leveraging incentive funding or outcomes-based funding, or additional funding for learners to go into these areas to kind of really give that oomph, and that the priorities that these states and all states are setting kind of have that I was going to say tractionable, but that's not a word, have the traction that they need to kind of make the real changes.
So, thank you. And I know right now we've all been focusing on those bright spots of communicating across industry, K-12 and higher education and government, but sometimes we're just not speaking the same language. And even if it's, an actual word and not a made up word, but we all have our own jargon, our own lingo, our own processes and ways of doing things. This is open to all of the panelists. Can you share with us any barriers you've encountered when working across these different partners, or when trying to communicate with people that maybe you don't typically work with? And if you've developed any strategies that have helped you along the way. So anyone feel free to kick us off and we'll go from there.
Well, at least on our end, in broadband 5G in Ohio, the biggest barrier or issue we face in that respect is business and industry don't speak education academic language. And so trying to pull together college deans, university deans, and academics and put them in the room with industry is relatively hard because they're talking to each other but not understanding each other. So the way to overcome that is really to have key people who kind of speak on both sides, who can literally translate the different lingo and just the wants and desires and issues that pop up. So for us, our critical partner has been the Wireless Infrastructure Association, and the chief technology officer at WIA is Dr. Rick Thacker. Not only has he been in the industry for 30 years, but he's also an adjunct at University of Maryland. So he can speak both ways. And so he's been a great asset for our work to make sure that we can translate between industry and education. And a lot of it's just stakeholder management too. Universities have a specific lens that they want to go, and that may differ from industry. So it's really trying to get to where we need to go while also making sure everyone's needs are taken care of. So it's a lot of stakeholder management, but having key people who can help facilitate those conversations is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I fully agree with Eric. It's comical. I used to be in the Air Force and I was a foreign language translator. And I still feel like my key skill for this initiative is translating, is whatever room I'm in at the moment. If I'm in a room with a bunch of educators, I'm the least knowledgeable person on what's being said. But my job is to play that translation part across those different working groups and make their work accessible to each other. I think there's some other just human behaviors that pop up, and none of these are meant to villainize people. We're all culpable of these. We have a tendency, we all represent a silo. If we're in a working group and there's someone there from an educational institution, their head is down, focused on that educational piece. And it can be difficult sometimes to simultaneously tell someone, you're doing a great job, but I need you to pick your head up and consider some equities that don't necessarily live within your silo. So getting people to look at the bigger picture sometimes can be difficult. I think there's another tendency that sometimes the owners of these one-off, well-intentioned programs don't necessarily understand the scope of the broader challenge. And so sometimes when I'll go to recruit someone to join the fight, I'll get an initial reaction of, oh, I'm already addressing that. It's already being handled. And again, you want to, tell them what a great job they're doing and recognize their successes, while also making sure they understand you might have solved this problem in your backyard, but we're talking about a very large state and the challenge is very large. Let's help add some firepower to what you're doing and make a bigger impact. I will say I'm very pleased to report that something I expected would be a challenge has not been, which is people's openness to innovative ideas. I expected a lot of walls to be thrown up when we, let's break down this norm and try something new, try something fresh that goes against maybe traditional policies. And I'm happy to find out that stakeholders across South Carolina have been very open to this innovative approach of trying something new and not just defaulting to what we've tried in the past and what feels comfortable.
I think for things that I've learned with this, it's really, I would say, agility and flexibility, especially in traditional four-year schools. So I've used the quote before. A university president told me that it's easier to change the course of history than a course in history. That has not a dig on history majors. It's about the process within our university systems. It's one thing that I've seen in cybersecurity in Georgia, as well as with the FinTech Academy, is that we were starting to see those barriers break down, and they were extremely, extremely agile. Technical college systems tend to be, traditionally in many states more agile, and they're programmed and they're built to be that way. But four-year degree universities have tended to be less agile. But I hope what you're saying, Brian, and what I'm experiencing here in Georgia is we're seeing an evolution of that people have to, they're really looking at this as a bigger investment in what they're investing in people. And I think this other idea about translating, I mean, it's amazing, as I've said in some of these conversations and listen to academics, people that are workforce development, and then the private sector. Many times the private sector will really think of, and they'll talk to the university as if they were, a little, an industry, a manufacturer on a conveyor belt of brains coming across, and you just have to program them and get them into the marketplace. And that's not how it works either. But so you do have to have that translation about how do you develop people, and how do you develop not only the hard skills, but the soft skills that help them be successful for the long term.
Absolutely. It's really interesting points about just folks who wear a couple different hats. I also adjunct at the higher ed level, and you would think it's all education. There's K-12, there's higher ed. What's the big difference? Sometimes we have the same acronyms, but they mean completely different things, and it's all still within education. So it can certainly be complicated to work across all these different partners. Let's kind of go in reverse order. We'll start with you, Larry, on this. I know every state's programs are in different stages of development and implementation. Georgia's been working on this for quite a while. Can you share with us some of the successes that you have seen? We've been focusing on data, so any, hard statistical outcomes or developing relationships, maybe some more of those soft skills. What have you seen on the positive side?
Well, I think, I would go back and point to those areas that I've already actually mentioned. The FinTech Academy was a great success for us, really pulling together the public and private partnership to make sure that happened. And that happened both with not only developing the programs and the methodologies of developing that program, but also bringing together the funding from both the public and the private sector to make sure that this programs were a success. Cybersecurity. Georgia Tech, deep roots in this area, but it also led to the investments of the Cybersecurity Center with the University of Augusta in Augusta, Georgia, that is focused on training the skills of the future as well as developing entrepreneurism so that we can think about what the next generation of ingenuity is as well, which is also requires, highly skilled workforce to be able to fuel those as well. And then really this focus on what are the cross-cutting skills that will feed into a technology and industry and innovation industry across multiple sector lines, really thinking about the aptitudes that people need, as well as those other skills, and then being able to start to develop the people and getting connected with industry through, again, bringing back apprenticeships, higher emphasis on internships, practical knowledge, and building those. But I have to agree with, I think it was Brian that mentioned the idea of training trainers is continuing to be a lot of pressure on us for that. One of the challenges is we train trainers, we train teachers, and then they get scooped up by the private sector because they can pay more. And so we're in this cycle right now of how we can keep those great trained people that will continue to train the folks that we need to get skilled.
Yeah, I'll jump in next here. Obviously, we're kind of at the early stages here, so it's too early to report outcomes. But in terms of how we are measuring success right now, when we conducted the study, I think we took swirling chaos and added some structure to it, made it clean and accessible. Put the governance structure in place of these working groups, and now each of the working groups is now building out into chaos again as we then refine the way forward. So I think success right now is that we are speaking the same language, something you mentioned a minute ago, Amy, that when we say career pathways, does everybody in the room have the same view of what we mean by that? Do we picture the same map in our minds? Agreeing on which items are in our mission space and which ones are not. Where do we spend our limited resources? I think another success right now is that we're starting to take incoming fire. Stakeholders are reaching out to us to find out how they can get updated and informed, how they can get involved. A year ago, it was us having to do all of the outreach and call people and try to get the call to action. We're seeing that response come in now, which is a great success of its own. And then the industry response has been very positive and very validating. When I go to events like this and speak about what we're doing, usually it's private sector representatives who come up quickly and just convey their appreciation that they're hearing us talk about this in a way that considers their equities. I think multiple stakeholders are hearing themselves and their perspectives now in our narrative that maybe they weren't hearing before because we talked about things in such a siloed way. So I think our biggest single success is making this whole challenge and solution very accessible to very different types of parties who have been waiting to hear themselves in the narrative.
And then for us in Ohio, as far as outcomes go, we announced our broadband 5G workforce strategy in September of 2021. We're at 11 programs now statewide, everything from tower technicians, 5G readiness, fiber optics, et cetera. We've got another 4 programs in the pipeline to launch towards the end of this year. We've had over 300 students enroll in our programs. And of those who have completed, we've got a 92% certification rate. And this is where the data comes into play, which is being able to track not just enrollments, but completion and then certification. Because at the end of the day, just because you complete, we need to make sure we're teaching you to pass the certifications. And so for us, now that we've got programs stood up, we've got a $9 million RFP out that's live through April, where we're going to regionalize the work. So basically, we can't centrally plan from the capital. We need to find local and regional leaders to really help regionalize the work, because this needs to happen statewide. And then the next piece is, once we get all the structures statewide set up, we start to hit critical mass with the number of programs. Then it's really, really focusing in on that end piece, which is making sure students are completing, passing their certification, and then the most important, which is getting placed in jobs. And so we're evaluating what can we do, because industry's not really great they're used to just handing their card with the website and go fill out an application and we'll maybe talk to you. And the labor market's not like that right now. You really need to be high touch in order to get the talent you need. So we're exploring ways how we can work with staffing agencies that work very closely with the telecom industry to fill that role. Because what we're finding is we have a handoff problem. We get people to complete, and industry is like cheerleading, but there's this weird, awkward handoff where students can fall through because we're not seamlessly connecting program completers to employment. So what we're doing is exploring how can we work with recruiting firms who have their own financial interest in making sure they're getting placed, while it doesn't cost us anything because we're producing the supply. So we're trying to find innovative ways to do this, because it's a real challenge. It's great you put in all the structures and you get people going through and completing, but if they're not getting a job at the end of the day, that's not success to us. And so we're really trying to think through how to focus on that piece.
That's awesome. And that's a great way that y'all have been able to use that data, is to pinpoint where the moment of challenge comes in that handoff from, I have the experience, I've completed my program, where do I go next? And that feels like it's something that's very actionable, and you all have found that third-party support as well. Well, this is our final question before we start taking questions from folks who have joined us today. In a sentence or two, can you give us what you wish you had known before embarking on this work? It could be a lesson learned, it could be about a valuable resource you found, but if another state wants to take on building out their digital career pathways, what's one or two pithy sentences they should walk away with? Doesn't have to be pithy if I set too high of a bar.
No, it's literally one sentence. Trainers, train the trainers, faculty, qualified instructors. That's the number one. I wish I would have known starting out how that was going to be such a barrier to starting programs, because at the beginning, it didn't really cross my mind at the time.
For my part, it'll be a cybersecurity specific example, but a fantastic resource I recommend is cyber.org. They used to be known as NICE-RC, federally funded, but they offer free curriculum for educators, free educator training. They have information to help you understand cyber career pathways. So it's a free resource that states can use. And it's despite however complex you might want your educational pathway to be, they're a great kind of, step one to begin with.
Pithy. What I've learned is we don't need more training programs. We need more trained people.
I think that's a great note. And that it all does come back to these relationships and these individual people who have the skills, as Eric said, that you have a trained trainer and they have the people there who are ready and willing to work with them, and that we get those folks into careers that work well for them and give them a pathway moving forward. Adriana, in terms of resources, I know you've mentioned Pathways Matter and put in the link for Credentials Matter. Are there other resources that we could give people to walk away with to begin this work?
Yeah, great question. So I think you yourself are a great resource, right? Amy is our digital policy director and a kind of huge asset in being able to share what's happening in other parts of the US and kind of the resources and research that you're doing. On the Pathways Matter team, we do have that framework of 20 policies where we work with states to do that step back for when you're thinking about college and career pathways writ large. Where are your policy strengths that should be leveraged and celebrated, and where are there policy barriers or gaps that we can help you dig into? A return on investment analysis is one that we've kind of dug in more on the implementation side with some states. It's complicated and it's hard, and not many states are doing it at the whole state level. So how we can support in that. So we are here to support in that kind of brainstorm. And for 20, soon to be 20, South Carolina, Brian, it's coming your way. 20 states, we've mapped what's in place for the 20 policies across our framework as a kind of starting off tool.
Wonderful. Well, we have one question so far that I am very curious to hear your thoughts. Others can feel free to drop a question in the chat. We've got about 5 minutes. The topic du jour is artificial intelligence, ChatGPT. It's obviously creating all sorts of opinions and concerns and opportunities in the education space. How are you all viewing this from the perspective of the state level and working with industry? Do you see AI as another career area folks should learn about? Is it a threat to entry-level jobs? What's your hot take on this?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll start by saying something we've heard a million times. You'll roll your eyes, but then I'll make it kind of real to the conversation. Let computers do what they're good at so that humans can do what they're good at. The cybersecurity equivalent of this, there are dozens of flavors of what you can do as a cybersecurity analyst. I know that in my day job, I never get to do the strategic level thinking I want to do every day because I'm busy putting out the fires and answering the emails and doing the lower level tasks that have to be done. And the same is true for cybersecurity. And I suspect it's the same for many technical industries and professions out there. The more that we can use AI to handle the lower level alerts and warnings and triaging incoming problems, the more that our cybersecurity professionals can focus on the strategic architecting and strategizing of cybersecurity. So, it may require some shifting of what we think of as entry level or not, but if it allows us to take the workforce and push the entire workforce up to address higher level things that humans are best at, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, from our perspective, just my perspective at least, and for white collar jobs, AI itself is probably not going to replace you, but a human competitor who knows how to leverage AI is going to replace you. So I would be focused on learning how to leverage this technology to make yourself more productive.
Yeah, just piling on, it's a tool. It's a tool that we've all got to learn how to use, how to apply it. Every time there is an innovation that is that disruptive, there's so many more opportunities that come out of it. And I think you focus on the opportunities, and we all know the cliches that come out of that. So I look forward to the opportunities.
The Luddites will be right one day, but not today.
It's going to be robotics. It's going to be a lot. It's automation. I mean, automation has been a trend throughout technology for a long time, whether it be digits in the software or atoms in the physical world. So got to look out. So look forward to more robotics as well as other machine learning, artificial intelligence. All of those things will disrupt us.
Well, I think I'm sensing a potential future webinar topic right there. I really appreciate all of your time today. Thank you to our insightful speakers and our attendees for joining us today for this important discussion. As we move forward, it's clear that we face existing and emerging challenges in this digital age, and that it requires collaborative efforts from policymakers, educators, industry leaders, and communities. And as we all work together, we can ensure that all students and all citizens have access to the skills and opportunities they need to thrive in today's workforce. So thank you all again, and thank you to everyone who joined in this afternoon. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.